possible. So, what is the value of what we have just heard? It's great fun hearing Shakespearean English in response to our queries, and it is indeed a very smart thing for technology to do. But the reason why I'm asking this general question, is Shakespeare still relevant? It's because 50 years ago, a book was published called Shakespeare, Our Contemporary by Jan Kot, a Polish critic, which has had an enormous impact on the interpretation and performance of Shakespeare. That was exactly 50 years ago. And I think half a century on, it's time to ask the question again. Is Shakespeare still our contemporary? And to help us achieve this, we're thinking about the wonderful achievements of technology. We're in the 21st century. Shakespeare was 4 centuries ago now. We celebrated the publication of his complete works, the first folio, only last year, 400 years. That's a long time. And the question is does he still have anything to say to us, which artificial intelligence cannot say even better than the bard himself? The question is natural intelligence, which I think Shakespeare had in abundance, compared to artificial intelligence, and the relative value of those two things. To help us explore this question, is Shakespeare still relevant today? I want us all to think of a speech from Shakespeare. It could be a favorite speech of yours, a speech you know well, a speech you remember. Any speech. You can put it in the chat box, or you can simply think if you can't be bothered to write in the chat box. I'll be asking you a lot of questions because I would like your participation, at least on the level of thought, if not actively using the chat box. So you're thinking of your favorite speech. A lot of people will think of something from Hamlet, something from King Lear, as I have chosen. This is my favorite speech from King Lear. And I'm going to let you read it and listen to it in just one moment. But as you listen, without worrying too much about difficult vocabulary, ask yourself, does Shakespeare in this text refer to things, to issues, to problems, which are still with us today and perhaps still unresolved? That is the question, as Hamlet would say. Let's hear Luke's favorite speech from the whole of Shakespeare.
Poor naked wretches, wheresoe'er you are, that bide the pelting of this pitiless storm, how shall your houseless heads and unfed sides, your looped and windowed raggedness, defend you from seasons such as these? Oh, I have ta'en too little care of this. Take physic, pomp. Expose thyself to feel what wretches feel, that thou mayst shake the superflux to them, and show the heavens more just. Let the superfluous and lust-dieted man that slaves your ordinance, that will not see because he does not feel your power quickly. So distribution should undo excess, and each man have enough.
Isn't that wonderful? It is for me, and very powerful. And I'll tell you why. The things Shakespeare mentions, problems which are still, I think, unresolved today, include the following. I've highlighted some words to help you follow. The text can occasionally be difficult. What strikes us immediately is the reference to poverty. Do we still have this problem with us today? Homelessness. He has this wonderful word, houseless, in the phrase houseless heads and unfed sides. Take physic pomp. Here by pomp, he means the rich and the powerful who can afford luxury. That's pomp. In comparison to the wretched of the earth, as they have been called. So the inequality between wealth and poverty, luxury and deprivation. And in the last couple of lines, he mentions the possibility that things could be better if the superflux, the excess of wealth that we see all around us, could be shared more justly to show the heavens, life, I suppose, the powers that be, to be more just. So those are some of the problems we're kicking off with. And my next question is whether in this same speech, which is actually two speeches from King Lear put together, whether Shakespeare proposes any possible solutions. Let's have a look. You can think yourselves about how these questions of poverty, homelessness, inequality can be resolved. But Shakespeare gives to Gloucester in King Lear. Gloucester is an aristocrat who has lost everything, and he's in the wilderness there with King Lear, played by Ian McKellen as King Lear. And they are realizing what they had when they were in power and what they've lost now that they're out in the wilderness. And here in this extract, I want you to focus on the last two lines. Is this a solution that Shakespeare is putting forward to these problems? He says, or Gloucester says, so distribution should undo excess, and each man have enough. Well, that sounds pretty modern to me. And it sounds radical, but it's not quite clear what he means by this. Is he some socialist ahead of his time? Or is he a philanthropist who feels pity for the poor and would like the excess wealth that is available to be shared a little bit more generously with the poor? We'll see as we go along exactly what he means by this. So distribution should undo excess. It sounds like a possible redistribution of wealth and power. Is it? Or is it something else? So before we go any further, I want us to stand back and look at Shakespeare as a whole. And from your knowledge, however complete or partial, can you please think what it is that Shakespeare time and time again comes back to in his plays? It's more than one thing, of course. He seems to be preoccupied by particular issues. Can you think of these issues, these topics, by predicting what you think are the most common nouns in Shakespeare's plays? And then I'll give you the answer according to artificial intelligence. What are the nouns which are most frequent in Shakespeare, and therefore the topics he's most preoccupied, if not even obsessed with? Write your suggestions for nouns in the chat box, or merely think about your answer if you prefer. Think of Romeo and Juliet, think of Lear, think of Hamlet, all the history plays, the comedies. What does he talk about again and again? Well, AI tells us if you've said love, you were right. The bigger the word, the font, the more frequent the word is in Shakespeare's work. So love is very common. It's obviously a topic which he is very, very interested in, and we would expect him to be, because it is a very universal topic. But in very large letters here, and therefore very frequent, are the concepts of kingship and the aristocracy, the two words king and lord. Together, I think they constitute a passionate interest in the nature of good governance, the nature of power, and in a feudal context to some extent, because kings and lords and monarchs and so on belong to a kind of feudal era. And this is what I'll be focusing on, not the love aspect, that's for a future webinar, I hope, but we'll focus on those in power and how they handle and how we can hold them to account, as somebody once said. So kingship and the aristocracy. Let's look at a statistic, and I want your help again. This is factual information, which I gleaned from the internet, which tells us how wealth was distributed in terms of property, the ownership of land in Elizabethan England, and of course in Tudor times generally, which is the period we're looking at. There is one number missing in this piece of information about how much land the royalty, the aristocrats and the nobility, and the landed gentry, I've highlighted there, how much land they actually control. Can you think of a number? Any number from 1 to 100? Well, the answer is very simple and shocking in a way. If it's true, even if it partially reflects the truth, it's a surprising and worrying inequality of wealth in Shakespeare's time. So it's natural that he should be preoccupied with this imbalance in wealth and control of England by the aristocracy. The 2%, they comprise 2% and they own most of the good farmland. So let's take that with us as we think about the significance of the influence of the upper classes who did control so much of the land in terms of their ideology. This is one theory about how people in Shakespeare's time saw the world, their worldview, if you like. And as you look at it, again, I want you to write a word or think of a word which describes this arrangement of society, where at the top of the pyramid we have God and the angels, divinity, if you like, and then we have the monarch, the leading feudal lord, followed by the aristocracy, the church, the clergy, and the gentleman, Sir William Shakespeare or whatever. And right at the bottom of the pile, just before the animal kingdom, the plants, the rocks and the stones and the earth and the trees, are the ordinary people, the commoners as they were called in those days. They're also called the multitude. And we'll see how Shakespeare saw the multitude by, again, drawing on artificial intelligence. So I ask in a very anachronistic way, what about the workers or the commoners, as Shakespeare calls them? He also calls them the multitude very frequently. And he uses specific adjectives to describe the ordinary people, the multitude, the crowd. Can you predict some of the most common adjectives he uses to describe ordinary working people, people on the land, people in the city of London? Are you thinking, how does he describe them? Think of Julius Caesar, if you know the play, where the people play an important part. But how does he see them? Well, this is what our word cloud or Wordle, generated by AI, tells us. In the whole of the works of Shakespeare, I asked the computer to tell me how Shakespeare frequently, mostly describes ordinary people. Well, is it positive or negative? The bigger the word, remember, the more frequent the adjective. I'm hit in the face immediately by the word rude. That doesn't mean to say they were impolite. I think that's a more modern meaning. Rude means something more like vulgar, of a low social position, crude, if you like. But very large also are the words barbarous, a barbarous multitude, the base multitude, the common people. Bold, again, looks like a positive word. Actually, I think it means something like reckless, not knowing the limits, cheeky, bold. The crowd are bold. They take rash decisions. So there's a picture for us to take on board. You could look at all of the words and compare them, but it's a fairly consistent picture of the people. And it's pretty negative on the whole, isn't it? Even the word great simply means numerically great, not to be admired. Lawless, and so on and so forth. What does all this mean? Well, we'll see what it means in the context of two of the topics I've taken for today, which Shakespeare is preoccupied with: war and revolution, which are sadly still issues today. So that's our topic. There's an image generated again by AI. How clever it is. But how clever is it? We'll see. These are the plays I'll be looking at. I've already glanced at my favorite Shakespeare play, King Lear, with a picture there of Paul Scofield in the definitive performance of King Lear, ever produced, according to actors themselves. I'll briefly be looking at Henry IV, another king, Henry VI, another king, King Henry V, another king, The Tempest, where we have Prospero, the magician, and on the right, bottom right, one of my favorite Shakespearean actors, Alan Howard, playing Coriolanus. So those are the 6 plays we have time to look at in the context of war and revolution, or rebellion, if you like. Perhaps we need to take into account that people rebelled, there were uprisings, and occasionally revolutions or coups d'etat conducted by the aristocracy very often. The barons were constantly squabbling amongst themselves. And we're going to look at not the aristocracy in the reign of Henry VI, but the people and why they rebelled. Henry VI Part 2 is probably the very first play that Shakespeare wrote. Very first play, Henry VI Part 2. Then he did his prequel, Henry VI Part 1. Then he did a sequel, Henry VI Part 3. He had a jolly good time writing these history plays. Now, historically, in 1450, there was a rebellion by the people, the peasants, called Jack Cade's Rebellion. And they really wanted to take over the whole country. They were very, very angry. What were they angry about? Jack Cade, the leader of the rebellion, and his fellow peasants. As some of you may know already, I want you to predict as we go along, but here I've jumped the gun. Historically, Jack Cade's rebellion was about their dissatisfaction with the government because the government was corrupt. It was badly administered by Henry VI, a very weak king. Abuse of power by not only the king, but his fellow barons. And there were these endless wars, military adventures, and the name itself, 100 Years' War, tells us that the poor people of England were for 100 years being used to fight foreign wars, very often simply as cannon fodder, as we shall see. So these are the historical facts, according to the internet. And I think it's probably more or less true. But what does Shakespeare say about this rebellion? Before we look at it, its claims and its aims, I want you to think of your own political manifesto. We are in a pre-election period in Europe and in England at the moment, for those of you who didn't know. If you were presenting your manifesto to the people of the country and expecting their vote, what one issue would you bring up in your manifesto? Think of one thing that you would include. You can think about it, you can write it in the chat box, and then we'll compare with the manifesto that Jack Cade and his peasant rebels put forward as they tried to change the government of England in 1450, and which Shakespeare approaches in Henry VI, Part 2, as I said. So you're thinking of your ideal political manifesto. One thing that you're not going to do a U-turn on, you'll say it and do it. Well, this is what Shakespeare says. According to Shakespeare now, not history, but the way Shakespeare presents history in Henry VI, Part 2, we have a group of issues which Jack Cade puts forward. I've highlighted the first area, which is, broadly speaking, education. And there's Jack Cade on the left, played by Michael Pennington at the Royal Shakespeare Company. And what Shakespeare tells us is that the rebellion was about closing the grammar schools, perhaps open comprehensives, who knows? I don't think so. For you teachers of English, Jack Cade wanted to ban the teaching of grammar, nouns and verbs and subjunctives. Finished. He would also make literacy, the ability to read and write, a criminal offense. And as for foreign languages like French particularly, and Latin, no thank you, only English would be spoken. The second platform is to do with food and drink. Jack Cade promises cheap bread. Perhaps you would agree with that. You would agree, I'm sure, a lot of you, with good beer, lots of it at a good price. And free wine. Sounds like utopia. Do you also agree that we should kill all the lawyers? Notoriously, this comes up in Henry VI, Part 2. And getting rid of the judicial system. No courts and no training of new lawyers in the Inns of Court. All of this will go. There will be no money, like today. Eventually, I suppose, there will be no money circulating. We'll just have credit cards. But they meant no money will be used in the England of the Revolution, according to Jack Cade, according to Shakespeare, remember. And all the citizens, in what seems to be a rather Stalinist concept, will wear the same uniform, or like a school uniform, if you like. So if you like the idea of uniforms, Jack Cade is your man. At the bottom, we have again, as we did in King Lear, a reference to all things in common, a kind of socialism before socialism. So this is what Shakespeare says. The important thing, though, is the context in which Shakespeare presents these aims of the rebellion in 1450. And as we look at small extracts from the play, your critical thinking will ask questions like, is Shakespeare making fun of the revolution? Is he giving us a realistic or satirical view? Is he in favor of the rebels or against them? How do we know? If you're a language teacher or interested in language, this is a kind of applied use of language to interpret Shakespeare's point of view. To help you, I've given the claims of the rebels in red, and the way Shakespeare presents these claims, the point of view he puts forward, his attitude, if you like, in blue. So, for example, there shall be no money, says Jack Cade. Everybody will wear the same livery, same uniform. And we'll all be brothers. Sounds pretty good. Brotherhood of man, perhaps women too. And then he throws in Jack Cade's claim that they, the people, will worship him as their Lord. And that kind of deflates the whole thing, doesn't it? It undermines the revolution and its sincerity and what is in store for the people. And Dick the Butcher chips in with, let's kill all the lawyers, as we said. And on the right, you see a production of the play with Jack Cade in the middle and perhaps Dick the Butcher on the right, who wants to kill all the lawyers. He's got his tool there in his hand ready to kill all the lawyers. Cheap bread, as we said, lots of good beer, socialist society. And then he throws in again, when I am king, as king I will be. And who said, Jack Cade, that you would be king? Well, it's Jack Cade who claims he's going to be the future king. And all the people, the multitude, cry, God save your majesty. It's satirical, isn't it? I think this is the idea. We're not meant to take it very seriously. He's taken the piss quite literally and metaphorically, because here we hear Jack Cade promising to make wine flow through the city instead of urine. The pissing conduit, pardon my French, will run nothing but claret wine. Well, 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 wonderful free wine for the whole city of London. But then he spoils it again. We all want free wine. That would be great. But treason for anyone that calls me other than Lord Mortimer, because Cade thought he was actually a descendant of the Mortimers who had a claim to the throne. So anyway, anybody who doesn't respect him as the successor to the throne will be hung, drawn, and quartered. But there are serious arguments, which Shakespeare on this occasion doesn't seem to make fun of. The justices of the peace will be abolished. In other words, the judicial system will be abolished. Why? Well, there's a serious reason why they were against the courts and the laws and the judges, because if you were illiterate and you were presented with accusations in a language you couldn't read, you were likely to be punished without being able to defend yourself. And this is what the rebels say. Moreover, thou hast put them in prison, he says to the king's men, and because they could not read, thou hast hanged them. So there is an inequality here of the educated elite on the one hand and the poor illiterate folk on the other, who couldn't defend themselves in court. We've seen that they want to get rid of grammar schools, not to replace them with comprehensives. And you English teachers out there and French teachers will no longer be able to inflict pain on children by talking about grammar, nouns and verbs and so on. But look at this. The poor old clerk of Chatham is asked whether he can write instead of just use a mark across for his name. And he admits that he's quite proud of the fact that he can write. But what does the government, the rebels, what do they decide to do with this literate clerk of Chatham? Well, it tells us, hang him with his pen about his neck because he's a traitor. So a satirical view of the rebellion, where literacy will be punished and the use of foreign languages like Latin will be punished, and French, of course, because the French were the enemy, as we shall see in the 100 Years' War. So no French, no Latin. And if you did, you would speak these languages, you would be punished. To finish our presentation of the manifesto of Jack Cade and his rebels, we see this aristocrat here, a gentleman, let's say, Sir Humphrey Stafford, who tries to diminish Jack Cade, the leader of the rebellion, by calling him and his father a plasterer. He plasters buildings, a humble trade. Jack Cade's answer is very interesting. And I want you to think why he replies to the insult, your father was a mere plasterer, with Adam was a gardener. And he goes on to explain that we are fighting for our liberty, and when we get our liberty, there will be no more lords and no more gentlemen. But what about this Adam was a gardener? What's he getting at? Well, I'm sure you're thinking, well, like Rousseau might have said, we were all once very humble. We were all born equal. but it's actually a reference to the peasants' revolt from 1381, when one of the intellectual leaders of the peasants' revolt, almost a century before, a man called Ball, spoke to the people who were rebelling and gave them courage by saying things like, on the left, you will have come across this quotation, many of you, when Adam delved or dug the ground and Eve span, who was then the gentleman? And then we get Rousseau, centuries before Rousseau. From the beginning, all men by nature were created alike. But this is Shakespeare, well, it's not Shakespeare, but Shakespeare also comes back to this principle of equality and common ownership of the land. And John Ball goes on interestingly to say that our bondage and servitude came in by the unjust oppression of naughty men. I love that adjective, naughty men, because it means evil men. So everybody was born equal, but everywhere they are in chains, as it were. That's the peasants' revolt. But back to Jack Cade in 1450, and we see, to sum up, he has important claims, but the claims are undermined by his ambition to become a dictator. Only he will make the laws. My mouth shall be the Parliament of England. It's quite funny, really. And all things shall be in common. Again and again, they come back to this theme of sharing the land. So social democracy and socialism are not new ideas. They go back to the 15th century at least. But does Shakespeare always make fun of these ideas, these utopian ideas of equality and the sharing of the wealth and the land? No, he doesn't always satirize utopian ideas. And from his very first play, Henry VI, Part 2, I'm going to go to the last play he wrote alone, without anybody's help, and that was, which was his last play before I show you. He comes back in the last play he wrote on his own to this question of common ownership and utopia, an ideal world. And the play, of course, the last farewell to the theatre, was The Tempest. And in The Tempest, at the end of his career, Shakespeare gives these moving, eloquent words about an ideal society, not to a rag bag of peasants and illiterates, but to a good guy, an educated aristocrat, Gonzalo, who's a good man. And he talks, actually quoting the work of Thomas More and his utopia, that riches and poverty will be in common in his ideal world. Nature will produce everything we need. We'll have lots of leisure time, no more crime, no more knife crime, no guns or other destructive engines. It means engines of war. But nature will provide for all of us, as we all know it can if we allow it to provide for all of us. So Shakespeare doesn't make much fun of Gonzalo. He can't resist poking a little fun at him in The Tempest. But notice how the idea of common ownership comes back right at the end of Shakespeare's career. Now we're going to move on to a rebellion of the people, which Shakespeare takes completely seriously. And we mustn't be too serious ourselves. There is place for humor, I think. And the name of the play I'm going to look at rhymes with the word heinous. And I've quoted a musical based on Shakespeare's Taming of the Shrew called Kiss Me, Kate. I've adapted it a little bit, and I want you to guess the missing word, which rhymes with heinous. And it will give us the title of the play by Shakespeare I'm going to talk about now. Can you guess? If he says your behavior is heinous, kick him right in the... What's the name of the play? And the hero, so-called, of the play? Are you thinking of a naughty word? I'm a naughty man, as you can see. Coriolanus. Yes, indeed. Kick him right in the Coriolanus. It's an interesting double entendre, isn't it? A pun. But let's see if Coriolanus is what this rhyme suggests he is. Is he a bit of a you-know-what? Well, what is the problem? What's it all about? Why are the people out on the streets of London or Rome? Because the play's set in Rome, but it's really about Shakespeare's London. Mass protest and rebellion. What was it all about? Well, in a nutshell, the conflict was all about, on the one hand, the people who wanted a better life, particularly corn, so they could make bread and survive instead of dying, and a leading aristocrat of the state, Coriolanus or Caius Marcius, as he's called as well, who doesn't want to give them this corn. So there are the people. Caius Marcius is our enemy. And Marcius tells them when they come out to the streets to get home, you fragments, very contemptuously. You see, the historical background, which we need to bear in mind, is that Shakespeare knew that there were food riots in Elizabethan England or Jacobean England frequently, and particularly in 1607, as this matches the possible writing of the play. And it was all about the people being afraid of starving to death. So that's the historical fact. Let's see how Shakespeare presents the people and their claims in this play. They are struggling to avoid starvation because corn is at a price which they cannot afford. So the first citizen, the leader, doesn't have a name. We are all resolved to die than to famish. So they have to fight for survival. And they argue very coherently, and Shakespeare does not make so much fun of them on this occasion. They argue that the authorities, the powers that be, the state, has more than enough, a surfeit of wealth and corn particularly. This superfluity, this excess is enough for everybody to live comfortably. They don't want to bring down the government. They just want a better life. But the state, with Coriolanus, the aristocratic military leader, refuses to give them corn at a decent price. We are too dear for the state, say the poor people. Too dear. And it's all about profit. You see, the multitude Shakespeare presents now have their head screwed on. They know what's what. And they know that their misery is making others profit to gain. And there's a wonderful pun in the next line. Let us revenge this with our pikes before we become rakes. There's a lovely pun for you. You'd become a rake because you'd be very thin out of starvation. And notice Shakespeare stresses that they're doing this in hunger for bread, not because they want to cause trouble. They don't want to cause trouble. They don't want to overthrow the government. And they also say the legal system. We come back to the legal system. And here Shakespeare gives us a very coherent case on behalf of the people, where laws are made against the people's interests and in favor of the elite, the aristocracy. Edicts, laws, are made in favor of usury or money lending at high rates that the people could not afford. Acts which defend the interests of the rich, laws in other words. Statutes, again, laws that restrain and chain up the poor. Shakespeare's very eloquent. He had a way with words. And of course, the ever-present wars, the 100 Years' War, the Wars of the Roses, even if they had enough to eat, the wars would still eat them up. And that is from Act 1, Scene 1 of the wonderful, underestimated Coriolanus. And the aristocrats here on the left, Menenius, On the right, Coriolanus, played by Ralph Fiennes, an excellent film of Coriolanus. They know the arguments are fair and just. What do they want, says Coriolanus. What are they making all this fuss about? And Menenius, his friend, says, for corn at their own rates, whereof they say the city is well stored. And we're told this time and time again. They have the grain, they have the corn. What are they doing with it? Well, what is Coriolanus doing with it? Why does he refuse to give the people the corn? Well, because he's, can you guess? How can you profit from the availability of corn? Well, there are two answers to this. One is he hoards the grain, not for his own profit. No, perhaps not. The play doesn't say that. But it says he hoards the grain in order to feed his army, because he's a military hero. He loves war. He's pretty committed to fighting and violence. The play shows this very, very clearly. Okay, so that's why the play tells us he hoards the grain and won't give it to the people. But Shakespeare himself, some of you will know this is just by the way, was also accused of hoarding grain, the man from Stratford, and avoiding his tax, but that's another story. It's an interesting little irony. But back to Coriolanus. To sum up, the people want corn, and in response, Coriolanus and his fellow aristocrats treat them with contempt. They are merely the many-headed multitude. They don't have a name. They're just a monster with many heads. There you are, to finish our review of Coriolanus. Coriolanus is exiled by the people from Rome, and he goes over to the enemy to fight with the enemy against Rome because the people's judgment is that he should be kicked out. But before he does leave Rome, he calls them fragments, dogs, curs, you common cry of curs, dogs. And they've banished him from Rome. So as he's leaving, notice what he says as he goes over treacherously to the enemy to fight against his own city. Despising you, the city, thus I turn my back. There is a world elsewhere. Indeed, there is a world of war and destruction. But what does it mean to call the people fragments and dogs, curs? What does it tell us about how Coriolanus, not Shakespeare, this is not Shakespeare, but the character Coriolanus, how he perceives the citizens? The play is very critical of Coriolanus. It's a very multi-sided play. It doesn't just take one point of view. Well, I'll remind you of the worldview, as it's called, the Elizabethan worldview, the great chain of being, it's also been referred to, that we saw at the beginning. And you notice who is at the top of the hierarchy and who's at the bottom. The commoners, you see, are there with the animals, curs, dogs, the plants, and the minerals, rocks and stones, fragments. Only an object could be a fragment. And this is the way the poor people are presented. And we said that war was one thing that they complained about, that apart from starving, they were constantly being sent off to war as cannon fodder. Can you guess now, your turn, to think of the most common adjectives that Shakespeare uses about war? What would you use to describe war? Do you agree with Shakespeare? So I'm going to show you what AI says. The whole of Shakespeare's work, his perception of war. Are you thinking? You can write, or you can just think to yourself, and we have a dialogue in one form or another. Think of the wars taking place now on our beautiful green and blue planet, where nature, we know, could provide for all. These are the adjectives Shakespeare uses about war If I ask the computer to tell me the modifier, the word before the noun, immediately before, this is what it tells me, that war for Shakespeare is bloody above all. And sadly, it is civil war, where brother is fighting against brother, father against son. The worst kind of cruelty is, of course, civil war. And it's a pretty negative picture. There are a couple of positive words there, because if you broaden the context in which he looks at war, Shakespeare has a rather contradictory view. If I ask the computer to tell me on either side of the keyword war, what are the three words on either side that most frequently occur, we get more positive adjectives like brave and noble, warlike, fierce, bold. I see contradictions here. I don't know about you, but obviously brave will probably refer to the soldiers who are fighting the king and his fellow army, his army. And noble, surely war itself is not noble. There seems to be a kind of contradiction here. And this will be reflected in the play that we focus on in just one moment. When I look at war, I'm going to look at the people on the receiving end, the slaughter of the innocents, I call it, ordinary people, poor people who don't want war, who have not brought the war upon themselves. But let's go to Henry IV first, the play, and the king, Henry IV. There he is, Jeremy Irons, and he is advising his successor to the throne, Prince Hal, the crazy, madcap prince, how to conduct war when he gets to power. What advice do you think the king is giving his son and successor about war? What advice would you give a politician who wants to succeed at war? Probably no advice, I'm sure. But the king here has a responsibility to prepare his son to govern. And he tells him this. Are you thinking about what advice you would give the future ruler of the land? Well, what King Henry IV says, who came to power through a coup and the assassination of his predecessor, Richard II, what he says is, be it thy course, your policy, your politics, to busy, giddy minds with foreign quarrels. That's very eloquent. Shakespeare had a way with words. Busy, giddy minds, easily translated into distract the public, distract the people who are easily distracted by starting a war abroad, usually in this case with France or Spain. Is this still relevant today? Is Henry's advice about war still what happens in modern politics? Do politicians today, of all colors and all political convictions, I'm trying not to take sides here, I was spoilt for choice, do politicians still follow this advice to use war and foreign wars to distract the people from their domestic problems? Are you thinking of past wars, the present sad wars, as I show you this headline, where at least this journalist thought that one reason Mrs. Thatcher went to war in the Falklands was to distract from her unpopularity at home and to help save her political skin. So she went to war with Argentina. She won the war, if you like, at the cost of many, many lives to save her political skin. Good for her. But also today, coming up to date, one report I read said that Netanyahu, who is up to his neck in corruption and is waiting for the courts, of course, to catch up with him once the war is over with the Palestinians, but he's also using the Iranian threat, according to this article, to distract from the mess of the Gaza campaign. the terrible tragedy there. So 2 examples, and a third one, so you don't think I'm being partial. This is Putin's war in Ukraine. Is often criticized for being a grim diversion from domestic failures. So whether we agree or disagree with these journalists, it still seems sadly to be a principle behind the cause of war, the diversion, the distraction of the public from problems at home. And these ideas, of course, didn't fall out of thin air, out of the sky. There was a very influential political theorist, an Italian that some of you will guess immediately, who advised the prince or the ruler about how to conduct government, how to wield power. And above all other skills, he recommended that war was the art that the prince should master above all. And who said this? You can write it in the chat box, or you can think of the famous Italian theorist who is still very influential today. He was influential in Shakespeare's time. He's often referred to in Shakespeare's plays and other Jacobean and Elizabethan plays. And his name, of course, was Machiavelli, a realpolitik theory of cynical manipulation of power, where the end justifies the means. And that's what you have to do if you want to grab power and keep power. A very influential book, and just listened and read a biography of Machiavelli himself. Wrote lots of other things, but the one his book is famous for is The Prince, Advice to Rulers. And let's look at an example of all this in action. 2 interpretations of Henry V, Shakespeare's heroic, patriotic king. Is he an ideal king? Was Henry V a good king, a hero as Shakespeare perhaps presents him, or was he a butcher as perhaps Shakespeare presents him? Shakespeare is very good at taking multiple perspectives, as we shall see. And these 2 pictures from 2 different films of Henry V show the conflict of opinion. On the one hand, Laurence Olivier's wartime patriotic version of Henry V, filmed with Churchill's support in order to help us fight the Nazis. And it served a very useful purpose in rousing people to resist Nazism. And on the right, we have Kenneth Branagh's more cynical version of the film, the play, the film of Henry V, where it's a less flattering picture of Henry V. Let's focus on the nature of war and the concept of a humane army. If you're a hero, like King Henry V is often made out to be, I would have thought humanity was one characteristic of a hero. Even when he's at war, he would show mercy and pity towards his victims. Is this the case with King Henry V? Well, when he goes to France, because the story is King Henry goes over to conquer France, the endless war against France, and he wants to be the French king. And he goes outside the gates of Harfleur, which is in France, and the Harfleur citizens are besieged. They've locked themselves in. They refuse to give in to the invader, the English. And King Henry is outside with his army. And he says to them, if you don't open the gates of your city so I can take it over, the gates of mercy shall be all shut up. And what will he do once he gets into the city? He will let loose his soldiers, hard of heart and bloody. And what will they do to the citizens, to the mothers and the children of Harfleur? They will mow them like grass, your fresh fair virgins and your flowering infants. That's what King Henry says he will do to the people of Harfleur if they don't hand over their city to the English. They're French, but there were constant squabbles over who was going to control. Now, there's something very interesting here I'm going to show you a modern headline which matches uncannily with an extract from the speech by Henry V, who's outside Harfleur trying to make the people submit. This is the headline. Some Israeli politician, I don't know who he was, he blamed the children of Gaza for the massacre of their families and themselves, their mothers and the children themselves. The children of Gaza have brought this upon themselves. It brings tears to your eyes to read such a thing. They're not innocent, he says. These children are not innocent. And Henry V, if you look at this extract, uses words which echo what this Israeli general said centuries later. Can you see the words there that match? You children of Gaza, have yourselves to blame. Well, King Henry says something very similar. And again, he mentions the virgins that have an obsession with raping women, don't they? Hot and forcing violation. You yourselves are the cause, says Henry, if I massacre you and rape your women, kill your mothers and your old men. You have yourselves to blame. That's what he says. So, what do you think? Is he an ideal king or a hero or a butcher? What do the people say? Well, before we come to the people, I wanted to mention that the siege of Harfleur, the threat of massacring the people of Harfleur, was not a one-off for King Henry. He's taken a lot of French prisoners. And at some point during the battle, he gives the order when the French reinforce their scattered men, when they're ready to fight again against the English, that every English soldier should, well, that doesn't sound very heroic to me. Sounds like a war crime. That's what we'd call it today. But that's what he says. Every soldier will kill his prisoners. And he says it again. We'll cut the throats of those French prisoners we have, and not a man of them that we shall take shall taste our mercy. Nobody will be shown mercy. No mercy, no pity. That's the hero, Henry V, or the villain. What do the people say? He says, in his defense, that his war against France is just and honorable. Well, is war ever just and honorable? Look at this dialogue where he and his refers to, can you guess? I would he were here alone, and many a poor man's lives saved. Who is he? The response is his cause being just and his quarrel honorable. The picture, which is not a very good one, I apologize, it's from the film by Kenneth Branagh. It shows the king himself in disguise, going amongst his soldiers on the night before the famous Battle of Agincourt. And he has conversations with his soldiers. One of them is called Bates. And Bates says, I would the king, he, were here on his own, and then all of us would save our lives. We poor men were being sacrificed. Henry, in disguise, tells Mr. Bates that no, the king's cause is just and his quarrel is honorable. It's an honorable war. Says Bates. If his cause be wrong, though, if it's not an honorable war, a just war, our obedience to the king wipes the crime of it out of us. In other words, it's a crime, but we won't be responsible because the king is all powerful. We're just obeying orders. We've heard that many times. And talking of the ordinary people, are these the names of ordinary people, commoners? They sound like names from a map. Are they places or people? Bedford and Exeter, Warwick and Talbot, Salisbury and Gloucester. What are they? People? Places? What is all this about? Well, this is the famous speech before Agincourt that I mentioned a moment ago. And the king is trying to rouse his soldiers both aristocrats and commoners, to fight to the death to conquer the French. And we see that the names that shall be remembered in future, when this heroic battle is recalled in years to come, the names that will be remembered will be Bedford and Exeter, Warwick and Talbot, Salisbury and Gloucester. These names shall be in their flowing cups, freshly remembered. This story shall the good man teach his son, and Crispin shall ne'er go by from this day to the ending of the world. But we, who are we? Who are we? We in it shall be remembered. He's just said, we are these aristocrats, Bedford and Exeter, Warwick and Talbot, Salisbury and Gloucester. We few, we happy few, because they're the elite. There's a few of them. We band of brothers, or does he mean the whole of the army? Does he mean the commoners, the ordinary soldier are his brothers? Look at what he does in one fell swoop. King Henry V, before the Battle of Agincourt, to persuade these ordinary anonymous people to fight to the death. He abolishes, as I call it, class distinctions. What do I mean? Look at that verb, gentle. Think about it. We few, we happy few, we band of brothers. For he today, whether aristocrat or commoner, that sheds his blood with me, shall be my brother. Be he ne'er so vile. Vile here means humble, of the people, from a village, a peasant. This day shall gentle. I love that verb. It's an adjective which Shakespeare has brilliantly made into a verb, which means he will make gentlemen of the peasants who are going to die in the Battle of Agincourt. Be they ne'er so vile, however humble they will be gentlemen, although the names are the names of aristocrats, and gentlemen in England now a bit, blah, blah, blah. You know how it continues. Those gentlemen who haven't come will be forgotten, and they'll regret the day they did not die in this battle. So we've nearly finished. But notice how, when they count the French casualties and prisoners, the ones that count are the ones with names, with titles, dukes and lords and barons, knights, squires, and then some ordinary men are thrown in for good measure. Besides, as an afterthought, common men, our multitude that you remember we discussed. And notice the pun. Here was a royal fellowship. Royal here means great fellowship, but also regal, royal, to do with the aristocracy, to do with those who are close to the king. Royal, it's a great pun, and it contains much irony, packed with meaning. I wish we had time to analyze, but when we count the English dead, notice the ones who are named and will be remembered are the dukes and the earls and the gentlemen, the esquires. None else of name. Say that again. None else of name. The common people are just, well, Falstaff will tell us, won't you, Falstaff, what the common people are. From Henry IV. The wonderful, full of contradictions Falstaff, who is given a role in the war to muster recruits. But look how he talks about the recruits he's collecting for the war. Which words does he use to describe the ordinary people he's recruiting to go and fight? Just look at the language here. I'll shut up and let you look at the key words. How does he describe the soldiers, the ordinary people he's recruiting? Look at the words, adjectives, and some nouns too. I have got in exchange of 150 soldiers 300 and odd pounds. Why is he talking about money? Such a commodity of warm slaves, not good enough to toss. Food for powder, food for powder. What does that mean? They'll fill a pit as well as better. Tush, man, mortal men, mortal men. That's what he says. The great Falstaff is also a ruthless war profiteer. He's making money from those people who can afford to pay not to go to war, and those who do go, the commodity of slaves, suckers. We're going to go and fight for King Henry. Food for powder, what we call today cannon fodder. Food for powder. Mortal men, mortal men. Their fate is to die, as we've seen. That's more or less it. I have two things to say. One, briefly, one possible ending of this play, Henry V, this wonderful play about war and anti-war, if you like. One possible ending is the romantic, the comedic one, where Shakespeare gets King Henry to court the Princess of France, Catherine, there she is, and he says to her to persuade her to marry him, because he's conquered France. Now he's going to conquer the princess. She says, oh, well, I can't marry the enemy of France. He says, I'm not the enemy of France. I love France so well that I will not part with a village of it. I will have it all mine, including you, fresh, fair virgin. And he succeeds, of course. That's the comedic ending, because comedy ends in marriage, tragedy ends in death, as we know. But there's another possible ending, and I'll shut up now and just let you enjoy what I call Shakespeare's hymn to peace. It's from Henry V, and it's the Duke of Burgundy making an impassioned plea for peace. And I'll give you time to have a look at it and listen to it as our farewell for today. I will nearly have finished. But just listen to this hymn to peace, worthy of Beethoven's Ninth Symphony, the Ode to Joy. And he's talking, Burgundy, the Duke of Burgundy, to the King of France and England. And this is what he says. I want you to think about today, our world, as you listen to this plea for peace.
In Shakespeare's Henry V, the Duke of Burgundy appeals to the kings of England and France to consider the virtues of peace and to end a destructive war. I demand, before this royal view, what rub or what impediment there is, why that the naked, poor, and mangled peace, dear nurse of arts, plenties, and joyful births, should not in this best garden of the world, our fertile France, put up her lovely visage. Alas, she hath from France too long been chased, and all her husbandry doth lie on heaps, corrupting in its own fertility. And as our vineyards, fallows, meads, and hedges, defective in their natures, grow to wildness, even so our houses and ourselves and children have lost, or do not learn for want of time, the sciences that should become our country, but grow like savages, as soldiers will, that nothing do but meditate on blood. My speech
There you are. It goes on. There is more. Very, very eloquent. In the midst of war, there is this speech about peace. And I have two photographs of the two current wars that preoccupy us and the media every day. The Ukraine, first picture, this land of fertility, Shakespeare says, corrupting in its own fertility. And below, the vineyards of Palestine before the war. Things could be different, couldn't they? That's Shakespeare, the wonderful William Shakespeare. And I asked you at the beginning, is this still relevant today? Well, I could think of a lot more topics and issues and problems which remain unresolved, which he explored in his inimitable natural intelligence and genius. From poverty to environmental decay, dictatorship, equality and inequality, homelessness, hunger. It's all there. No wonder he's large, as Walt Whitman described himself. Shakespeare is large, myriad-minded Shakespeare. Coleridge called him. He's very large. He contains worlds, multitudes, interesting word, because it fits our meaning of multitudes, the people, and of course, massive diversity. And he contradicts himself. Like Whitman says, he takes different points of view, often equally convincing. Do I contradict myself, says Shakespeare? Very well. I contradict myself. Like Whitman, I am large, I contain multitudes. But AI is here to help us, is it? Resolve these issues that I've listed a moment ago. Can it help us? It can give us information, no doubt, and I've used that information. And I've tried to turn that information into knowledge. But there is more than information and knowledge that we need to make AI worthwhile. We need, as many people have said, critical thinking. We need to know what to do with this information, to transform it into knowledge, to appreciate its significance. But can artificial intelligence also give us something else that only perhaps natural intelligence like that of Shakespeare can give us? And that is wisdom. T.S. Eliot, long before the age of AI, wrote this in a poem which anticipates this debate about AI and technology and digital tricks and whatnot today. Where is the wisdom we have lost in knowledge? Where is the knowledge we have lost in information? How do you make information into knowledge? You have to know what it means, interpret its value. And how do you make knowledge into wisdom? Well, wisdom is knowing good from wrong, having compassion, knowing what mercy and pity mean, empathy, and all the rest of it. And we can go from the militaristic, jingoistic Henry V of we few, we happy few, to this poet's response, ye are many, they are few. Who are ye? You. Who are many, and they are few. You know who the poet is on the right? It's a strange echo of we few, we happy few. Ye are many, they are few. It's a romantic poet, 19th century. He died young, like Keats and Byron, but it's Percy Shelley. Ye are many, they are few. Rise like lions after slumber, in unvanquishable number. Shake your chains to earth like dew, which in sleep had fallen on you. Ye are many, they are few. This image, I take Coriolanus's threat or promise that there is a world elsewhere, and he went over to the enemy to continue fighting and killing, and blood is constantly drenched in blood. To a possible response from the ordinary people on the streets, us, the citizens, we say to Coriolanus, another world is possible. And I'll leave you with that thought. And Shakespeare's Duke of Burgundy and his wonderful speech on the beauty of peace. Thank you very much for your time. Any questions, any comments? I haven't been looking at the chat box too much, but Nick, if you want to reconnect.
Oh, I am here. Thank you so much. Look, this was simply amazing. Thank you very much. Please feel free to share your comments in the chat.
Thank you. I don't know if we have any questions, Nick.
Thank you so much, Luke. It was simply amazing. Not that I expected anything less, of course.
I don't know if you want to, shall I unmute people? I don't know if anybody wants to say anything.
They can do that.
Or they can unmute themselves.
They can do that if they want to. They can, now's the time to say things.
If you want to ask me
by comments.
Any comments, I'm happy to field the questions. You're all stunned into silence by Shakespeare.
It was Julius says, why do Goneril and Regan betray King Lear? Okay, that's perhaps a question for another webinar.
What's the question, Nick?
You can see it in the chat. It says, why do Goneril and Regan betray King Lear?
That's another
question for another talk.
Long time to discuss Goneril and Regan. I don't want to take that on now. My voice is already hoarse. I think I should shut up.
You can see the chat, can you? There are lots of comments in the chat.
Yeah, I'll have a look at them. I tried not to confuse myself by looking at people's comments, not distracted. Andrew, do you have anything to say for yourself?
Well,
Andrew,
yes, that's, thank you. That when you gave us Eliot saying information, knowledge, and wisdom, those three words together, I think it was all in what you've been saying. All three things were there, and I'm overwhelmed, so I'm not able to comment further. Thank you very, very, very much indeed.
Thank you for coming. Thank you, Andrew. Well, people are popping off. I kept you for over an hour. Alan, any comments?
I'm just thanking you from the bottom of my heart. Yeah, it was just what I expected, only more so. And I loved that, and I would have been very disappointed if you hadn't brought in the Duke of Burgundy's speech towards the end, because I think that, you know, that's kind of the epitome of Shakespeare's understanding, you know, so thank you again.
Yeah, thank you for your support. And I thank Nick Michailidakis once again for being incredibly supportive.
Thank you. As Penelope says, we're looking forward to the talk on love and Shakespeare.
Yeah, well, there's more. This is supposed to be the first of a series. If I'm strong enough to work on, and well, I have them ready. The question is if I can deliver them. The next one is on class conflict and economics in Shakespeare. The third one will be about women, Shakespeare's unruly women. And if I can, I'll do a fourth one on his politicians and what they do get power and how they use and abuse it. Shakespeare has so much said, there's so much of him, Nick. You know, there's...
Can we have the politicians first?
Almost
I know lots of people are interested.
The book can begin with Richard III. Well, you saw Henry IV himself giving us an example of realpolitik, which Henry Kissinger puts very effectively or ineffectively into practice, and it's still with us today. The cynical view of the ends justifying the means. Machiavelli has a lot to answer for, but he did write other things as well. He did give some good advice, but it's all about power, isn't it? Getting it and hanging on to it. Well, if you don't want to have a discussion, you've all got lives to lead. We had a good turnout, more than I expected. Thank you to Nick for that, and his friends in the media. Thanks to AI for all the help AI gave me, the people who helped me use AI. Okay, we'll come back again one day if we're all well. The world is not very well, is it? Let's hope we're around to do the second and third and fourth parts of this series of webinars.
Look, one last question. Many people are asking, is this going to be shared somewhere, the
But
video?
if you record, I think you started recording a little bit.
Yes, I'm still recording it actually.
Yeah,
Okay.
well, you can edit it and we'll start from wherever you started.
Well, at the very beginning, except for the AI.
Yeah.
thing.
Yeah, we
Start
missed
at the
that.
very beginning. Okay.
Well, you and I could do it together like we did.
Yes. Okay.
And then, because it's a shame Russell's
Yeah, it
I
we've
forgot
focused
to
on other
add
things, and I
Russell Stannard
Yeah.
for his contribution at the beginning, his interview with Shakespeare. Thank you, Russell. You see, it takes a group of friends to do these things. You know, we don't do these things alone. You know, we do much better when we work together. So thank you once again, Nick, and thank you to my friends and colleagues who appeared today.
Thank you, everyone, for joining us today.
Thank you, Luke. Thank you so much.
We'll be in touch. Thank you all.
So
One and
everyone,
all.
bye.
We happy few who are left over.
Thank
Goodbye.
you.
Goodbye,
Thank
everyone.
Others-
Bye.
Bye-bye.
Bye.
Bye. Thank you.
Bye-bye. Thank you.
Bye.
Bye.
Yeah,
Thank you. Goodbye.
hasta la próxima vez. Que tiene buen menú.
Thank you. Bye-bye.
Bye-bye. I don't know a lot of people, whoever you
Thank
are.
Thank you. See you again soon. Bye-bye.
See you. Bye-bye. Write to me. Don't
Bye
forget.
bye. Thank you so much.
Bye-bye. Go in peace, shall I say. May you
Bye,
go,
Luke. Goodbye.
may you go in peace. Bye-bye.
Bye.
Leaving you now.
Bye bye. Thank you so much. Thank you. Thank you.